It was supposed to be a science fiction triumph, bold, visionary, and ahead of its time. Blade Runner had everything: stunning visuals, a hauntingly beautiful world, and Harrison Ford at the center of it all. But behind the camera, things were falling apart. Tensions ran high, the atmosphere was icy, and one co-star in particular would change how Ford viewed the entire experience. Despite its eventual cult status, Ford has rarely spoken about the emotional weight and regret tied to this film. Now, years later, the truth is finally coming to light, and it's not what fans expected. Something went wrong behind the shimmering, rain-soaked sets of Blade Runner, something that soured Harrison Ford's entire view of the film. What was meant to be a groundbreaking cinematic event became, for him, a bitter memory. At the heart of that tension was his icy relationship with co-star Sean Young, a clash so intense it nearly derailed production. Critics may now call the film a masterpiece, but for Ford, it remains a chapter marked by frustration, regret, and emotional distance. So why does he still speak of it with such cold detachment? What really happened behind the camera, and how did it shape the legacy of one of the most visually iconic films of the 1980s? Before he ever donned the trench coat of Rick Deckard, Harrison Ford was already an unexpected Hollywood success. He wasn't born into fame, nor was he chasing the spotlight. Ford had worked as a carpenter, spending years on the margins of the industry, labeled a late bloomer with no clear path. But his grounded realism, shaped by rejection and hard labor, gave him a natural edge. He didn't buy into the illusion of Hollywood. That same guarded attitude made him magnetic, especially when he exploded into global fame as Han Solo, the roguish space smuggler with a sarcastic streak. Ford brought charm and grit in equal measure, but with Blade Runner, he was walking into a world that would test his patience, his professionalism, and ultimately, his passion for the craft. Behind the scenes, Harrison Ford was growing restless. While audiences adored him as the charming rogue of outer space, Ford himself felt boxed in. He didn't want to be typecast as a science fiction icon, reduced to cocky grins and laser blasters. He craved complexity, roles with emotional weight, raw vulnerability, and human flaws. But Hollywood had a habit of offering him more of the same: spaceship pilots, rough-edged adventurers, and stoic men who fought more than they spoke. It was success, but it wasn't fulfillment. Then came Indiana Jones. With Raiders of the Lost Ark, Ford stepped into the fedora and whip of a new kind of hero, still action-packed, but with just enough grit and charm to showcase his dramatic chops. The film was a cultural juggernaut, solidifying Ford as more than a one-franchise wonder. He could have played it safe, cashed in on sequels, and ridden that wave for decades. But in 1981, he took a sharp and surprising detour. He signed on to Blade Runner, a haunting, cerebral neo-noir from director Ridley Scott. The film was the opposite of everything that had brought him fame. The script was dense, the dialogue minimal, the tone cold and dystopian. His character, Rick Deckard, was emotionally numb and morally ambiguous. Why did Ford agree to such a stark departure? It's a question that would linger for years, among fans, critics, and even Ford himself, as the film grew into the cult classic he never saw coming. It was, some would say, a search for legitimacy. Others placed wagers on it, assuming he just enjoyed the visual storytelling style of Ridley Scott's Alien. Regardless of the rationale, he agreed to play Rick Deckard, a tired former police officer who hunts down renegade androids in a seedy Los Angeles. He found the character illogical, the narration awkward, and the writing unappealing, but when he arrived, that's when the trouble started. Ford sensed early on that the project would be difficult, not just because of the filming but also because of the person he would be starring against. An actress with a fiery personality, a unique style, and a complete unwillingness to make room for him. Sha Young was her name. Strange co-stars have always surrounded Ford. Above all, his dialogue has been so rigid and uncompromising that he has argued with George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars. Then he made it through the hectic atmosphere that infused the Indiana Jones movie's production. But Blade Runner was unusual in some way. The voice was oppressive. The shooting was vicious and prolonged. There was simply no chemistry with Young. Ford was unaware that Blade Runner would test not only his stamina but also his professionalism, patience, and the only way to deal with someone who wouldn't give up. He would go on to say that it was perhaps one of the most depressing productions he had ever seen. Sha Young was planning to arrive on the scene with more than just her lines, but the cameras hadn't started yet. She would have a strong will that would directly clash with Ford's composure. However, Ford wasn't hesitant because of the genre. He was forced to star with the woman. Let's get Sha Young in. Sha Young was on the verge of becoming one of Hollywood's biggest performers prior to Blade Runner. She was beautiful, ageless, eerie, and possessed a keen mind that would not settle for being just another attractive face. Even though she was still relatively new to the profession in the early 1980s, she was already the center of attention. Although she had been in Jane Austen in Manhattan and Stripes, Blade Runner was intended to be her big break. It was more than a role. She had the chance to establish herself as more than just a supporting character. She was aware that she would be the face of a dystopian noir, a femme fatale in a science fiction future. Half of it included Sha Young's finished screen test, while the other half saw Ridley Scott typing in her eyes prior to her portrayal of Rachel, a replicant who eventually starts to question her own humanity. She may radiate the fragility of her thoughts or the coldness of her emotions. And that is precisely how Rachel would be. As seen from beneath the glossy facade, the character had to remain unique, complex, and incredibly vulnerable. The role was particularly difficult for a young girl in the industry. Young was adamant about getting it, though, and she couldn't afford to waste this fantastic opportunity. Her performance is quite emotional and profound. She had the ability to see beyond the screen. A bit more unconventional. She doesn't give a damn about going overboard in her acting. On set, Sha Young was a woman who never engaged in politics. She was serious. Some found her attitude to the craft admirable, but others found it challenging, particularly when it came to Harrison Ford, her leading man. Their personalities were clearly different from one another at first. Ford was a methodical, introverted, and reserved individual. He saved his energy for the action in the movie by remaining virtually silent in between takes. Rehearsals were never voiced by him. He seldom gave things too much thought. He arrived, worked his hours, and then departed. Young, meanwhile, was reactive, openly so, and emotionally generous. She wanted to discuss speech, characters, emotional reasons, and everything else. She desired to collaborate with other actors. Ford wanted to stay out of the way. Ridley Scott was caught between the two leads. He was in charge of an intricate shot that included lengthy nights, smoke effects, continuous rain machines, and intricate lighting. The set had a cramped, wet, and visually stunning environment that was physically taxing. Furthermore, the friction between his two leads further increased the already high level of stress in production. It wasn't outright animosity. There were no public altercations or yelling bouts. Beneath the surface, something softly perished. Young felt isolated, and Ford himself described it as unpleasant. She subsequently remembered how she felt alienated from a movie to which she had given a lot of herself because some staff members appeared to be supporting Ford. As the movie progressed, an imperceptible barrier between them continued to grow stronger, but they both managed to overcome it. At least visually, the Deckard and Rachel sequences were successful on screen. However, there was more going on behind the scenes and behind the performance. Young thought Ford was aloof and uncooperative. Young was difficult for Ford to read and unpredictable. There was no romantic tension here. Emotional remoteness was the cause. And it became clear how broken their relationship had become when the movie's most contentious scene, one that every soul would talk about for decades to come, came around. And that same passion would start a firestorm behind the scenes once the cameras started rolling. A Black and Night production. Since Blade Runner's 1982 premiere, viewers have been plagued by a particular scene. It's the scene where Rick Deckard imposes himself on Rachel, forcing her to confess that she wants him while pushing her against the blinds and preventing her from escaping. It is stylized as a noir romance in the movie. However, it plays with an edge that many spectators find extremely unsettling. It was far more tense behind the scenes. The moment was not originally intended to appear on screen as it did. It didn't develop naturally, it changed while filming. In order to raise the emotional stakes between Deckard and Rachel, Ridley Scott pushed for a moment that would make it difficult to distinguish between control and want. He desired uncertainty. Instead, he produced a moment that seemed forced and oppressive. And it was absolutely heartbreaking for Shaw Young to film it. Tension between Young and Ford had been building for some time. There was a lack of trust and a poor relationship between them. Therefore, there was more than just acting involved in the discomfort during the filming of this crucial scene in time. It was real. Young later talked about how she felt helpless and defenseless when the scene was being filmed. Being young and inexperienced, she was thrust into a physical scene that had not been adequately rehearsed or sensitively handled. Most sets currently take requirements for granted. At this point, Ford didn't discuss the events of that day much. However, as time went on, he eventually acknowledged that it was a terrible experience for everyone. He doesn't give names. He doesn't go into detail, but it sounds like he doesn't take joy in whatever transpired on the site that day. According to some reports, the mood appeared clinical and icy, and it was filmed with few takes. The demands of the day, the weight of direction, and two actors attempting to get by without an intimacy coordinator or emotional check-in. Interviews conducted years later gave Young more incisive remarks. This scene was not intimate, she stated. When questioned about that section of the piece, she went on to say, "I was miserable." She claimed that realizing how disposable she was in the production's view was more significant. She felt degraded and unprotected. She had a prop-like feeling. It would come back to haunt her then. Ford would also be haunted by it, albeit in a shadowy rather than a scandalous way. They never truly got along. There was only that one story, given from two quite different points of view, with no reunion interview or fond memories. He was reserved and silent. Hers was damaged and rough. The scene's genuine aging is what's remarkable. When it was released, some of them at the time claimed it was an intense occasion. It is now dissected as a classic example of how female characters were portrayed and handled as only supporting roles in a male-dominated story. Rachel's diminished independence, her suppressed feelings, and Deckard's role as a gatekeeper of power rather than a lover. That power dynamic between Ford and Young was as evident in the stories as it was in real life. This was a turning point in the movie as well as in their already shaky relationship. Following that episode, the coldness between these two individuals became unbreakable. Then Ford stopped talking and Young backed off. The remaining scenes were expertly filmed, but they didn't personally participate in the process. Not a single moment reflected Ford's unease more than one notorious sequence that continues to plague the movie's history. It was his least favorite scene. The strain on Blade Runner behind the scenes would turn out to be one of the most unfair and misinterpreted stories in Hollywood, even if the public was unaware of it at the time. Harrison Ford's star power remained intact after the production, while Sean Young's career suffered a setback from which she never fully recovered. And a major contributing factor was the system's failure to safeguard vocal women, the press, and whispers. Following Blade Runner's conclusion, Ford went back to work on Return of the Jedi and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. He was experiencing an unstoppable hot streak. He was always reserved in interviews, particularly when Blade Runner was brought up. Shaw Young was rarely brought up by him, and when he did, his remarks were objective and medical. Most people assumed it was just another discreet co-star relationship that ended. A different version of the story, however, was circulating among Hollywood. Shaw Young had raised her voice. She had admitted that filming that sequence made her uneasy. When she felt disrespected, she had retaliated. She didn't exaggerate the role of the quiet, appreciative newcomer. And rather than being commended for her honesty, that early 1980s Hollywood mentality would have made her an easy target for being challenging. In a town where a person's reputation may ruin a career more quickly than any box office failure, this name proved to be challenging. That tag really stuck. The directors walked away. The producers are muttering. The casting directors think again. It was a horrible irony. Susan Young even took the proper action. She was expected to give a strong performance in a big-budget movie. She had, of course, broken the unspoken norms. The system penalizes people for refusing to remain silent about their experiences. On the other hand, Ford was largely unaffected by the commotion around her. The rumors of problems on set never mentioned his name. He was the hero's masculine leader. He never publicly criticized Young, but he also never stood up for her. He never acknowledged her account of events and never once offered an explanation. In its own way, silence is harmful. Many years after Blade Runner, Sean Young would talk about how shooten she became and how the industry turned against her, first subtly and then clearly. The lesson, she said, was that it didn't matter who was correct. She would not be silent, and being quiet did. She brought her reputation with her to every audition. She lost out on roles that she would have been ideal for. They recast her at the last minute. In every room, there was someone who had made up their mind. She posed a risk even when she arrived professionally and well prepared. She created a narrative. She was that Blade Runner actress. The most infuriating thing is that she did absolutely nothing. Ford's career, meanwhile, had a golden age. He became the embodiment of cool, masculine authority in roles ranging from Witness to Air Force One and The Fugitive. But Blade Runner, the movie that never received much of his attention. Despite being one of his most recognizable performances in terms of appearance, he frequently downplayed that fact. He once said quite plainly, "I didn't like the movie." In multiple interviews, he characterized the filming process as unpleasant, saying, "I didn't enjoy the process." Sean Young was never specifically referenced by him. Whether deliberate or not, that period of time simply served to highlight the story's bias. Young had a reputation for creating chaos for decades. Years later, however, more people are beginning to doubt that view, to see her as courageous rather than tough. I was placed in a situation that no young actress should ever have to deal with on their own. The decision to do the fallout work was not shared. While one star faded, the other rose. And behind the press spin and studio stillness was the true story of the toll that such imbalance took on humanity. And even after the cameras stopped rolling, the tension persisted. It only got worse. Young versus Ford in the Silent War. Sean Young was more than simply Blade Runner's enigmatic beauty by the middle of the 1980s. According to Hollywood insiders, she had turned into a problem. In a conventional sense, she wasn't blacklisted. Although her name didn't disappear right away, she was marginalized, stereotyped, ignored, and, most damning of all, talked about. Sean Young, however, did not back down in silence. She retaliated in ways that both positively and negatively affected how the industry saw her. Following Blade Runner, Young landed a part in David Lynch's ambitious sci-fi epic Dune. Even yet, she was unable to shake the memory of her prior set encounter. She was reportedly strong-willed on set, which is euphemism for refusing to be pushed around. She started to be portrayed by the media as challenging, erratic, and moody. The majority of it was not factual. It was a story. Narratives are also difficult to master, particularly in Hollywood. Young, however, was unfazed by the whisper campaign. Rather, she embraced the one thing that industry women are most afraid of. Speaking out in diverse interviews, she overtly criticized the situations she had gone through on Blade Runner. She known as out the disrespect she obtained and the emotional pain of shooting that notorious scene with Harrison Ford, not naming him because the villain, she nevertheless made it clear that what transpired became deplorable. Regarding her popularity, she failed to sugarcoat it. "They name me hard because I say what I assume," she stated in one interview. "If I were a person, they'd name me direct." That honesty did not make her any friends with top executives, but did earn her respect among a burgeoning range of women in the industry, even though they were too terrified to explicit it publicly. She became in advance of her time, calling out a gadget already a long time far away from coping with actresses who would no longer play fine. Up till that point, there have been no mention of Batman Returns. In 1991, Younger observed herself cast as Vicky Vale in Burton's set Into Movement Batman. But whilst she injured herself on set, Kim Basinger took over and crammed the role with very little time before the film's launch. Thus, it changed into that Young, desperate to be Catwoman in the sequel, lobbied tirelessly for the role. And while she did no longer get a name back, she made headlines confronting WBB in a full homemade Catwoman in shape, crashing studio meetings and annoying to be heard. To the press, it was eccentric, even weird. However, for Younger, it turned into survival. She sensed the door ultimate, and if she did not make noise, she might be forgotten. Sure, it turned into media stunt born out of desperation. And it went wrong. Tabloids tore her aside. Executives categorized her unhinged. And once again, the phrase hard again, this time with renewed volume. Ford was within the identical technology, devoting his time to dramas of remarkable prestige and extravagance in container office records. Most of these movies, The Fugitive, Patriot video games, Clear and Present Threat, brought as much as his legacy. But not anything approximately Blade Runner, honestly not about Sean Young. Supposedly, Younger's audaciousness changed into her signature, the weight she bore. She changed into a nonconformist. She stored her chin high, and the industry paid for it. But the simple truth under all the chaos changed into Younger desired to work. There were roles that she longed to play. She wanted the identical freedom of being incorrect, strong, and commanding as the men looking, commanding like Harrison Ford without questions asked. It wasn't just a combat towards the jobs she lost. It became in opposition to a device that decided she became too much, too loud, too demanding, too much unwillingness to manipulate. Years later, neither would neglect what it felt like to be trapped in a film with someone you couldn't consider. Blade Runner bombs. As the years passed, Blade Runner went from box office disappointment to cult traditional, after which to certified masterpiece. Critics who as soon as referred to as its slow and complicated now praised its visual brilliance, philosophical intensity, and timeless design. Directors like Christopher Nolan, Denis Villeneuve, and Ridley Scott himself started out referencing it as a gold widespread for technology fiction cinema. But whilst the film's reputation soared, something bizarre took place. Harrison Ford changed into celebrated, Ridley Scott became vindicated, and Sean Younger became ignored of the verbal exchange. In retrospectives and documentaries, Young's name became barely cited. In Making of Functions, her role as Rachel was decreased to a visible, and photograph of dark purple lipstick, perfectly waved hair, and icy detachment. Critics called the performance iconic, but failed to always acknowledge the actress behind it. And if they did, they not often noted the emotional and bodily toll that performance had cost her. Of all the questions, the one unasked was why was Blade Runner's redemption not prolonged to Sean Young? The answer could be very nuanced, even a bit uncomfortable. For one, Younger had by no means remade her Hollywood reputation. She didn't get invited to the massive premieres. She wasn't requested to weigh in on major retrospectives. There wasn't even a panel for anniversary celebrations that featured her alongside Ford or Scott. The industry had moved on without her. But, when Blade Runner 2049 became announced, fanatics guessed whether Rachel might make a comeback in some unspecified time in the future, and she did, but now not in a manner all of us imagined. One of the most haunting scenes inside the movie had Sean Young's likeness digitally recreated. However, Sean herself, she became slightly concerned. She became flown in for reference pictures, however she did not carry out inside the final scene. She changed into a framed double and virtual reconstruction. The filmmakers named this artistic decision, but to many it felt like very last erasure, the moment when one of the original Blade Runner stars became changed by using a simulation. Sean Younger stated in interviews that she discovered it surreal and bittersweet. She changed into neither angry nor sparkling with delight. How could she? She had lived through that overall performance. She had paid for it in methods no CGI double ever could. Meanwhile, Harrison Ford lower back to his role as Rick Deckard in 2049 and become lavishly showered with interest for this. He become praised in interviews for having the good nature to revisit a man or woman he had once hated. His United States of America wild cynicism about the venture have become pure passion. Disinterest became depth. Distance have become mystique. At the same time as again Sean Younger turned into sincerely absent from the photo. No longer most effective Hollywood, however it become fanatics too who disregarded her. For years many did realize Rachel, however did not recognize Sean at all. They failed to realize the infamous Digicam scene she driven returned on. They did now not realize how her profession paths closed quietly. They didn't understand that behind the flawlessly styled hair and bloodless, calculated transport was a young girl who had to armor herself just to survive the set. Only currently has an alternate happened. Essays now appear, online documentaries, even fan boards that have been visiting Younger's overall performance below any other mild. They started inquiring how an awful lot of that coldness in Rachel turned into actual acting and how much turned into due to that set of very emotionally alienating situations really. There they now see it. What appeared like robotic poise changed into real. Looking to hold in there in a room in which one did no longer feel bodily safe. Yet nonetheless Sean Young never begged for pity. She in no way begged to go back to the limelight. However she wanted acknowledgement, now not for simply surviving the Blade Runner, but for its shaping. She made Rachel unforgettable. No longer the costume, now not the lighting fixtures, no longer the Vangle soundtrack. Sean Young did it. And no one gave her due credit for some distance too lengthy. But, in spite of his regrets, the movie refused to fade. And that is while the tale took an sudden flip. Legacy without closure. For many years, Harrison Ford was tight-lipped about Blade Runner. He hardly ever brought it up in interviews until caused, and while he did, his answers were brief, even dismissive. He had famously clashed with Ridley Scott over the film's route. He disliked the voice-over narration the studio pressured him to document. He wasn't pleased with the very last reduce, and maximum tellingly, he never spoke at duration approximately Sean Younger. But silence has a manner of growing older badly. As Blade Runner converted from a afflicted production right into a pillar of cinematic history, human beings started looking returned. They wanted to know what truly happened in the back of the digital camera. And sooner or later, even Ford could not keep away from it anymore. Then got here a take-a-seat-down interview within the 2010s. It wasn't heavily promoted. It wasn't intended to fire up controversy, but in a quiet second, Harrison Ford did something he hadn't completed earlier then. He mentioned Blade Runner really and emotionally. He admitted that he did now not fancy making the film due to the fact the system became draining, the steady changes within the script, fluctuating moods on set, and lengthy work days. But when the interviewer brought up Sean Younger, things changed. The expression on Ford's face did not tighten as it did within the past. He failed to laugh it off. He stopped. She was new, he said. Ford went on to feature, the pressure on her was humongous. I did not make it easier. That line became the other way up decades-long guesses. Humans had lengthy assumed Ford simply stored to himself out of professionalism or irritation regarding Younger. On the other hand, in that short moment, he had admitted the reality. All had existed. There had been tension, some of which had been his doing. He did not intricate or flat-out apologize for it, but he didn't duck both. In Hollywood terms, that changed into large. This changed into Ford's manner of admitting what all of the gossipers around the decaying movie have been long whispering. At that Shaw Younger were left to climate Blade Runner a great deal on my own. He has considering come to be extra gracious. At some stage in the later press rounds for Blade Runner 2049 while asked again approximately the original film, he would call Sean's performance essential and elegant words he had in no way used earlier then. He nonetheless would not tell testimonies, nonetheless wouldn't percentage anecdotes, but he gave her credit. In the end, the fanatics saw it. The media failed to make lots noise, but the ones who cared have been individuals who have been watching the 1982 movie for a while. Individuals who had painfully observed Sha Young through the corridors of her rocky adventure, people who understood what it meant to be a female in a system that punishes audacity. And possibly that became the entire point for Sean Younger. It wasn't the moment for a comeback. The huge studio roles were now long past, and no Forgotten Icon tribute packages had been in the offing. However, the document had shifted, albeit subtly. Harrison Ford identified her, now not as a problem, no longer as a footnote, however as a chief element of a mythical movie. He did not rewrite history. He just readjusted his location in it. And by means of doing so, he furnished some things Sean Young had in no way clearly had. Quiet validation. Because sometimes it is not with contrition that remorse arrives. Now and again it comes inside the form of an interruption in the middle of a sentence, a line a touch softer than expected, a call ultimately spoken with appreciate. The separation among Younger and Ford was by no means intended to be formally reconciled in the public eye, and therein lies the essence of the shift. In a way of life that revels in neat resolutions, it stays unsure and fragmented. Nevertheless, via all debts, the Blade Runner off-display screen legacy. Ford's fleeting words of indifference acted themselves precisely to the end that they were anti-spectacle. What came about behind the curtain tells an exceptional tale from what made it to theaters. If you want greater raw, hidden Hollywood stories like this one, recollect to love, subscribe, and hit the bell. Stick round for our next video. There's plenty extra drama to discover.